He walked out the way Morgan Freeman has always walked out, with that particular unhurried grace of a man who has learned that presence matters more than performance, that stillness can speak louder than any gesture. There is something about Morgan Freeman that transcends the usual categories of fame. He is not simply recognized, he is trusted. His voice has narrated the cosmos, explained God, guided penguins across Antarctica, and told a generation of moviegoers what freedom sounds like. When he speaks, people listen with a quality of attention they reserve for very few things: scripture, perhaps, or the words of someone who has just saved your life. His voice has become, in a very real sense, the sound of authority itself, the sound of truth, the sound of something you can believe in. When he came through the late show curtain, the audience rose, not with the frenzy of fans but with something closer to reverence, the kind of rising that happens in the presence of something genuinely important. He settled into the guest chair with the ease of a man who had sat in 1,000 guest chairs, and had long since learned that comfort comes not from the furniture, but from knowing exactly who you are. At 87, he carried his years with the dignity of someone who had earned every one of them and had no intention of apologizing for any of it. He wore a dark navy suit, white shirt, simple elegance, the uniform of a man who no longer needed to prove anything. Stephen greeted him warmly, the band played, the audience applauded, and for the first several minutes everything moved in that easy, generous rhythm that happens when two people who genuinely respect each other are given permission to simply talk. They talked about the new film, about what it meant to still be working at 87, still finding characters that challenged him, still discovering that acting, real acting, required more courage the older you got, not less. They talked about the voice inevitably because you cannot talk to Morgan Freeman without talking about the voice. He was gracious about it, the way he had learned to be gracious about carrying that particular gift for 7 decades. People tell me all the time, Morgan said with that characteristic warmth, that my voice makes them feel safe, that it sounds like wisdom, like God, like their father. And I appreciate that, I truly do, but what they don't know is that there was a time when my voice was the last thing anyone wanted to hear. Stephen leaned forward slightly. Tell me about that. Morgan was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of someone deciding whether to answer, but the silence of someone opening a door he had kept carefully closed for a very long time. My daughter, Morgan said quietly. Edina, when she was 17, we had a fight, not unusual fathers and teenage daughters fight, but this one was different. He paused, his hands, which had been resting casually on the armrests, tightened slightly. I don't even remember what it was about, he continued. Some rule I'd set, some boundary she thought was unfair. I was trying to be a good father, trying to protect her, trying to do what fathers are supposed to do, and I used my voice the way I've always used it, with authority, with certainty, with that quality that makes people listen whether they want to or not. The studio was very quiet now. And she looked at me, Morgan said, his voice dropping lower, and she said 6 words that changed everything. She said, "Don't use that voice with me." Stephen didn't move, didn't speak, just held the space. I didn't understand what she meant at first, Morgan continued. I said, "What voice?" And she said, "That voice, the Morgan Freeman voice, the voice that makes everyone else in the world listen, the voice that sounds like God, the voice that makes people believe whatever you say. Don't use it on me. I'm not your audience, I'm your daughter, and I need you to talk to me like a person, not like you're narrating my life." The first tear arrived then, not dramatic. Morgan Freeman had spent 70 years in public and had learned to carry emotion with the same dignity he carried everything else. The tear simply came, the way truth comes when it's been waiting patiently for permission. And I got angry, Morgan said, because how dare she reject the very thing that had made me successful, that had given her everything she had. I raised my voice. I used it the way I knew how to use it, with power, with authority. I said, "This is who I am, this is my voice. If you can't accept that, then maybe you need to leave." His voice broke slightly on the last word. And she did, Morgan said. She left. And as she was walking out the door, she turned back and said, "When you can talk to me without performing, call me. Until then, I don't want to hear that voice again." Subscribe and leave a comment, because what happens next will break you. Stephen leaned forward, his own eyes beginning to shine. How long did it take before you spoke again? Stephen asked gently. 3 years, Morgan said. 3 years of silence. 3 years of me being too proud, too stubborn, too convinced that I was right and she was wrong. 3 years of telling myself that she would come around, that she would realize she was being unreasonable, that she would apologize. He paused, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. But she didn't, because she wasn't wrong, she was right. I had spent so many years being Morgan Freeman, the voice, the presence, the authority, that I had forgotten how to just be dad. I had forgotten that the voice that moves millions of people can also hurt the one person who just needs you to listen instead of speak. Tears were falling now, slowly, quietly, the way rain falls when it's been needed for too long. "When did you finally call her?" Stephen asked. "After 3 years," Morgan said. "I called her, and when she answered, I didn't use the voice, I didn't perform, I didn't try to sound like wisdom or authority or anything other than a father who had made a terrible mistake. I said, 'Adina, I'm sorry, I should have listened to you, I should have heard what you were trying to tell me. You deserved a father, not a performance, and I'm calling to ask if you'll give me another chance.'" He stopped, his hands were trembling slightly now. "What did she say?" Stephen asked softly. "She said, 'Hi, Dad,' just that, 'Hi, Dad.' And I knew from the way she said it that she had been waiting, that she had wanted to forgive me, that she had just needed me to understand what I had done wrong." Morgan looked up at the audience for the first time since the conversation had turned. 300 faces, many of them wet, all of them completely still. "We rebuilt our relationship after that," Morgan said, slowly, carefully, "and I learned something I should have learned decades earlier. I learned that there are two voices. There's the voice the world hears, the one that narrates documentaries and plays God and makes people believe in things they can't see. And then there's the other voice, the small voice, the uncertain voice, the voice that admits it doesn't have all the answers, the voice that says, 'I'm sorry and I was wrong and I need you.'" He paused. "And the second voice," Morgan said, "is harder to use because it requires vulnerability. It requires admitting that you're not the authority, not the narrator, not the one with all the wisdom. You're just a person, just a father, just someone who loves someone else and is terrified of losing them." Stephen stood up slowly from behind his desk. He walked around and sat on the edge of it, facing Morgan directly. He didn't speak for a moment. He simply moved closer, the way you do when someone is saying something that deserves proximity. "Morgan," Stephen said, his own voice thick now, "how is your relationship with Adina now?" Morgan smiled through his tears, a real smile, warm and fragile and completely genuine. "It's good," he said. "It's real, we talk every week, and when we talk I don't use the Morgan Freeman voice, I use the dad voice, the voice that asks how she's doing and actually waits to hear the answer. The voice that admits when I'm scared or confused or don't know what to say, the voice that's allowed to be imperfect." He paused. "But here's the thing," Morgan said, his voice growing stronger. "Here's what I learned. The voice I thought was my power, the Morgan Freeman voice, the one the world recognizes, that was never my real power. My real power was always the other voice, the vulnerable voice, the voice that could say I was wrong and I'm sorry and I love you more than I love being right." Tears were streaming down his face now, but he wasn't trying to hide them. "And when Adina was sick," Morgan said, his voice breaking completely now, "when she was in the hospital 5 years ago fighting for her life, I sat beside her bed every single day. And I didn't narrate, I didn't perform, I didn't use the voice that makes people feel safe or wise or cert. I used the other voice, the father voice, the scared voice, the voice that said, 'Please don't leave me, please stay. I need you more than I've ever needed anything.'" The studio was absolutely silent. The kind of silence that happens when a room full of strangers becomes, for a moment, a single organism sharing a single breath. "She recovered," Morgan said, his voice barely above a whisper now. "Thank God she recovered. And when she was well enough to talk, she took my hand and she said, 'Dad, I've heard you do 1,000 voices in 1,000 movies. But that voice, the one you've been using the last 3 weeks, that's my favorite voice. Because it's real, it's just you, and that's all I ever wanted.'" Morgan looked directly at Stephen now, tears still falling but his expression carrying something that looked like peace. "So when people tell me they love my voice," Morgan said, "I appreciate it, but I know now that the voice they're hearing isn't the voice that matters most. The voice that matters most is the one my daughter hears, the one that doesn't have all the answers, the one that's allowed to be afraid, the one that's allowed to be human." Stephen wiped his own eyes. When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "Morgan," he said, "what you just described, that's not losing your voice, that's finding it, the real one, the one that matters." Morgan nodded slowly. "It took me 70 years to understand that," he said. 70 years of speaking to learn how to listen, 70 years of performing to learn how to just be present." He looked out at the audience again. "If you have children," Morgan said, "or anyone you love, don't make them wait 70 years to hear your real voice. Don't make them wait 3 years of silence to hear you say you're sorry. Use the vulnerable voice. Use the uncertain voice. Use the voice that admits it doesn't have all the answers, because that's the voice they need. That's the voice that builds relationships. That's the voice that heals. The applause that followed started slowly, not performance applause. The kind that comes from deep recognition from people who understood what it cost to admit that the thing you're famous for isn't the thing that matters most. Morgan Freeman had spent 70 years perfecting a voice that the world trusted. But it took 70 years and 3 years of silence to find the voice his daughter needed. And that voice, uncertain, vulnerable, imperfect, real, was more powerful than any narration he had ever done. That night, laughter gave way to grace, and television remembered its soul.